Phil Irwin, President and CEO of Federated Rural Electric Exchange, will talk about the 10 lessons learned from the Safety Strategy Labs. By applying the lessons, your cooperative can experience significant benefits. I've known Phil for quite a few years, and not all that well, but enough that we argue about sports once in a while, because he's a K-State fan and I'm an Iowa State fan, and we go back and forth, basketball and so forth. But we're both in the Big 12, but we agreed that good thing Nebraska got out. Now the Iowa Hawkeyes can put up with Nebraska. So, Phil, come on up. Give him a round of applause. Thank you, Phil.
Well, good morning, everybody. I tell you, we talk about safety a lot and accidents and things to do to make sure we don't have these tragedies and stuff like that. And I will tell you, the vast majority of all workers' comp accidents can be prevented. It's usually people taking shortcuts, etc. But every now and then, we have a tragedy like happened here earlier this year, and that's what the insurance is for. Step up, take care of people, and hopefully not have any more of these as we go. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the lessons we've learned. Several years ago, probably about 2007, we did our first strategy lab. And it really came about because the co-ops in Ohio were experiencing a lot of losses in linemen. There was a few fatalities, several bad injuries. And as they were trying to look into what was causing this issue and this rash of injuries, they kept coming up with all kinds of different things. So they approached us about trying to come up with a new way of looking at things. And so Mike Bird and I, Mike pitched me a thought process of these strategy labs. And it sounded kind of intriguing to me, so I said, okay, let's go ahead and try it. And to give you a little idea of what a strategy lab is, it's basically, and we've done it here in Iowa, but we basically have a day where the folks in charge of safety come into a room, there's laptops in front of them, questions are asked, they get to answer it of how things work at their cooperative. And then they get to vote on them. Is this really how it works out in the real world, if you will? The next day, we bring a lineman in from every co-op. The following day, whoever's in charge of operations. And the last day is the CEOs come in and talk. I've been to a few of the CEOs' strategy lab session days before. It's always kind of interesting because when we're out there talking about things, they may say, would you like to see how your lineman answered that same question? And sometimes it's different. In fact, a lot of times it's different from how the CEO thinks things are being done versus how the linemen say things are being done. So one of the good things that came out of this is a lot of people, a lot of statewide changed their training. A lot of cooperatives changed the way they look at things and the way they operate to an extent. And at the end of my talk here about the 10 lessons learned, I will show you some changes that have actually happened. Now, as a lot of you know, I'm a bean counter, so I like to measure things and see if it works or not. And I got to tell you, I think this program has made a big difference in the things we've seen. So with that, I'll start out by putting a chart up here, if they'll go ahead. One of the interesting things is the DART rate. You have to measure things. And so here's the DART rate for the states that we did, the first 13 states we did. You can see the DART rate for those co-ops in those states, about 310, I believe, was 3.68. One of the things a lot of people want to do is be compared. How do we stack up to the investor owns? Now, I got to tell you, I really wasn't in big favor of this because I really don't care how the investor owns are doing. It wouldn't make a difference to me if we were half of the investor-owned number because we're still having accidents out there and we have to get that number down. So the idea is to get this trend going down as we go. So one of the things that we also did was we took a cross-section of co-ops and did a focus group. Now to get in the focus group, we wanted co-ops that had a DART ratio of less than 1.5 to 1. And we also picked 20 systems from across the country. Some systems were very large, some were very small. We just wanted to get a good cross-section of everything. The other thing was we wanted the CEO to have been there at least 8 years because we wanted to be their results, not their predecessors' results and stuff like that. So when we looked at the focus group, their DART rate was about 1.21, as you can see. Now again, I'm big into numbers. Don't try reading a lot of this stuff. But this is the 310 co-ops that went through the 13-state study. This is where their DART rates were. And you can kind of see that as you look at it, we have about 40 of these co-ops, so a little over 10%. DART rates were very high. They were above 6. Now, I guess one of the questions I got for everybody in this room is, do you know what your DART rate is? This is a very key, important measurement of how safety is being done. These are the accidents that are really happen, the days away, job restrictions, transfers, et cetera. Usually pretty serious claims. So our goal is to get this number down, and especially for that tail factor out there that's way out there. So we took these individuals, these 20 co-ops together, and kind of looked and asked them questions to kind of see how they were performing of this focus group. And then we kind of compared it to the answers that we got out of the 13 states that we'd done at that time. Now, to give you an idea, we've been through 27 states now with this program. So the vast majority of the co-ops have actually been through the strategy labs. And I got to tell you, the last results were pretty much similar to the first 13 states. So the numbers have kind of held. So when we get looking at some of the leading practices, one, CEOs take an active role in leading, managing, and overseeing their cooperative safety programs. And this was kind of an interesting thing we saw that 93% of those CEOs from the focus group indicate they do take an active role in their safety programs. They help with the design, the management, the rewards that are given, and more importantly, the discipline that has to be applied at times. A lot of them attend safety meetings, but not for the whole meeting. They want those chance for those linemen to have opportunities without the boss there, if you will, to be discussing things. In fact, when we looked at the focus group, 2/3 of those CEOs attend at least 75% of the safety meetings that they had at their co-ops. Contrast that to the 13 states, the 300 co-ops we looked at, 43% of those CEOs indicated that they made 75% or more of the safety meetings. It was kind of interesting. One of the CEOs, actually, to quote him, said management needs to be visible, vocal, and enforce a safety attitude. You can't really delegate this one away. You have to be responsible. In fact, when you look at the changes to the reset program that came about, one of those is management commitment. The management has to be committed. Another practice we learned, safety programs are actively managed internally. And this was kind of a thing we had going on that we saw. We didn't really ask the question initially, but we did ask of this focus group and have asked it since. You know, your employees have to take ownership for your safety program. You can't really delegate that to Federated or the statewide. If your employees are not going to actively manage their own safety program, they're not going to get much out of it. In fact, a lot of co-ops have been telling me that they've changed the way they've been doing this where they will have different linemen do different presentations instead of just the safety coordinator or somebody else always doing the presentations. They're starting to delegate that down so eventually everybody has to get up and talk about safety in some aspect. It's one way to make sure that everybody gets tied into it and starts understanding. So the more active participation you can have, the better. You got to take responsibility and accountability for your program. Like I say, you just can't delegate that to Brian's group or my group if you want good results. Another one of the leading practices, operations supervisors and managers are selected based on leadership talent and receive training in methods of supervising and managing employees. One of the interesting things that came out of the discussions early on, especially from the linemen and the operations people, was the discussion about one day I'm on the crew, there's a retirement, or somebody leaves and I get promoted to foreman. We all know that it takes a special skill to supervise people, and a lot of time our linemen do not receive any training in that. So imagine that. All of a sudden I get promoted to be the foreman and I have to enforce safety policies, discipline on the guys I play softball with, that I go hunting with, fishing with, etc. It's a very, very tough thing to do, and if you're just promoting based upon seniority and who's been there the longest, you may not get the very best person. In fact, when we looked at the focus group, they rated about 7.6 on a scale of 10 that this training was extremely important. In the 13 states, the CEOs rated about 4.7 out of 10, so quite a bit lower. One of the CEOs that participated in that said, top management has to be committed to building and maintaining a culture of safety by having the right people in the right jobs. And I will tell you that there's been several co-ops that have talked to me about this, and they've actually went back to their cooperative and made changes. Talking to some of the folks that were already in the foreman and the leadership roles, is this where you want to be? Do you have what it takes to train the right people? Have them mentoring. Find somebody that can be a good leader in your crews, not necessarily the next one that's in due for seniority to be promoted, but the one that can lead people and make those tough calls, and make sure you mentor them and develop them. The state of South Carolina was one of the first states that adopted their training programs to fit this mold. I'm going to talk about their results in a little bit, but they actually developed within RCA a supervisory course for linemen that was specifically addressed to them. The idea of teaching them what they need to learn to be able to handle things as they go. Another one, accidents and incidents are consistently and accurately reported according to a strictly applied criteria. You know, one of the things we have to do, we have to measure things to be able to tell whether we're getting better or worse in that area. One of the key things, I think, if you can get your employees, your linemen, to report their near misses without repercussion, because it's a lot easier to learn from near misses than to have a bad accident or something before we start addressing whatever the issue is. One of the other big key things also is sharing that information with your fellow cooperatives. If you've had a near miss go on several times at your co-op, chances are your neighboring co-op or somebody else in the state's been experiencing the same thing. One of the interesting things I found was one of the questions asked of the CEOs at one of the sessions I was at, how often are safety violations occurring at your cooperative? I think the vast majority of the CEOs answered it was a very low number, a couple times a month. I think the linemen answered it was more like 4 or 5 times a week the violations are happening out there. Again, that awareness, connecting everything. So kind of tied into that, and this is a big one here. This is hard to implement and hard to do. But safety violations are consistently disciplined according to a written, objective, and probably most importantly, well-communicated discipline policy. One of the things the linemen talked about in the states that we've done this is the inconsistency that goes on. Management plays favorites. They like Joe, they don't like Bill. Both do the same thing, one gets punished, one doesn't. So one of the big key things you need to have is a written policy on discipline of what's going to happen, and you need to enforce it strictly. You can't play favorites. It's awful hard to do. When we actually surveyed the groups, the CEOs in the focus group, 87% of those CEOs say that discipline for safety violation always takes place after every violation. Looking at the CEOs from the other states, 22% of those CEOs could make that same statement, that it always takes place. Think about that, 87 versus 22. That's a big number. That's a huge difference. One of the focus group CEOs, actually, one of the quotes they gave us was, employees are accountable for safety issues in performance appraisals, and foremen are held accountable for their crews. Now, one of the things that I've heard from some of the CEOs across the country is, if there's a violation, that not only maybe the employee gets in trouble, but who's his foreman out there on the job? Who let him do whatever the violation that happened? Are they allowing those shortcuts to take place? Because I'll tell you, that's where most of our bad accidents happen. Virtually all of them, we've had a violation of a safety policy. And sometimes the events can be very tragic. So getting everybody on board with that, and for the CEOs in the room, I'm not trying to throw this out, but I've actually had 2 CEOs tell me that when there are violations that have occurred, they get disciplined also, the CEO, because he didn't have his foreman, et cetera, on that same page of getting everybody there. So one of the questions we did ask is, what are your discipline methods for dealing with safety violations? Basically, a formal written warning, time off without pay, and last but not least, termination for repeat offenders. And that's very hard to do. But those co-ops kind of told us that you have to hold your employees responsible for their actions. And I will tell you that one of the co-ops recently told me that they went through that change period where they really weren't holding people accountable. Now they are. It's tough. It's really hard to make that change. It's tough on the CEO. And for trustees out here, it can be tough on you. You know a lot of these people that work for you, your co-op. And so a lot of times they don't like that when that change happens, and they will come and complain and gripe and all that. You have to remember, your role as a trustee is to support your CEO on that. You can't allow that division to happen within the ranks. Very, very tough thing to do and pretty hard. One of the other ones, productivity never compromises safety. That's pretty well known, right? One of the interesting things that we looked at was on a scale 1 to 10, does this happen? The focus group CEO rated it at 2.7, that it rarely happens. From the 13 states, it was more like a 3.8 was the number that was given, a little bit higher. Interesting enough, the lineman said it was 4.7 out of 10, that it happens a lot more frequently than everybody thinks. Could there be some disconnect there? A couple of the interesting things we heard, some of the quotes, was, I tell my employees, do not compromise safety for speed. Your life is much more important than the job. Another one said, we specifically reward good safety performance, and we do not have rewards for productivity. So I'd ask you to think about the last time you had an outage. What did you celebrate at the end of that outage? Did you make the comment, we got the lights on before the investor owned or the municipal? Is that the first thing out of your mouth? That's what we did? If it is, you're sending a message, according to these linemen, that productivity is more important than safety. Or do we talk about, we got the lights back on without any accidents, that everybody works safe, that we remind people of that? Earlier this year, we actually had another fatality with a lineman back east. Bottom line, out working an outage, night. Apparently he needed some additional equipment. Told the guy down on the ground, don't worry, I can get this done. We need to get the thing finished now. Took a shortcut, cost him his life. Been much better to stop the job then and go back in. One of the things that you got to ask, are your employees comfortable enough in stopping a job when something's not being done correctly? Do your younger linemen feel comfortable to tell the foreman or the more experienced lineman, the more seasoned guy, stop, we need to do this differently. That can be really tough to do, no doubt about it. I hope with this younger age of kids, though, I have a 22-year-old son, and I think they are more apt to do that than I would have been when I was 22, 24 years old. You know, I would look at somebody doing something, thinking, man, that's wrong. I probably wouldn't open my mouth, you know. I think the younger kids, especially if they're told they can without repercussions, are more apt to do that. That it also tells you getting that seasoned lineman to be able to accept those comments that come out of there. It can be tough. Another one, employees view safety meetings and safety training sessions as real opportunities to enhance the safety culture and improve your skills. I thought it was kind of interesting in that we were looking at the CEOs in the focus group, and one of the questions were asked, does corrective instruction always take place after known violations? In other words, we talk about what went wrong and ways to prevent it and make sure it doesn't go wrong again. And 73% of the CEOs in the focus group said that's what happens with their co-ops. That basically the CEO wants to know about when there's been a violation, and then what are they going to do to correct that and make sure it doesn't happen again. In the 13 states, the average, 41% of the CEOs said that corrective instruction always takes place after a violation. It was kind of interesting because you can really learn from mistakes. It's easier to learn from ones where there wasn't tragedy attached to it as opposed to those that were. One of the focus group CEOs commented that management needs to communicate safety to our employees, communicate the expectations of the cooperative that safety is an everyday thing, and it has to be. You can have the best program in the world working for you, and it only takes one slip up to make that go away. Another one, this is really important for all the boards out here. Investment in safety is a priority. 93% of the focus group CEOs indicated that investing in safety is definitely a priority at their co-op. It's part of their strategic plan. You guys know what this involves. Use it spending money for training, proper equipment, etc. As board members, you approve those budgets. You make sure that safety has the opportunity to happen. So it's kind of interesting, we found out that at co-ops that have a person that spends 75% or more of their time on safety, in the focus group, it was 60% of those CEOs say they virtually have almost a full-time safety person at their co-op. That compared to 23% of the co-ops in the 13-state study. It's not inexpensive to have somebody spend that much time on safety, but what are the other costs involved if you don't? Smaller co-ops, I know have gone together and have one resource, one person to handle a couple co-ops, which is a good thing. The more folks out there that are doing that too, they will tend to talk better amongst themselves, the safety guys at the co-ops, of what's going on out there that you can see. So, pretty important thing. Board of directors require accountability for safety performance from their CEOs. This was kind of interesting because of that focus group, 80% of the CEOs indicated that safety was a line item on their performance review, that they do have to answer for safety at their co-op and for their employees. It's also kind of interesting in finding out, we didn't ask this of the other states because this was kind of a question that came out later, so we don't have a comparison. But that focus group, 87% of them said that safety is discussed at each and every board meeting. They actually go over all the accidents that happen at the board level, so the board knows what's going on, and their corrective actions that are going to take place as a result of any of these accidents that they've had. Have to spend some time with that, and it can be a change. On-site inspections or observations are routinely and frequently carried out. This was one of the interesting things that, again, we kind of asked later on in the survey as we started having more comments pop up. And I don't know in Iowa if you guys do unannounced inspections from the statewide from whoever. I have personally seen a couple states that have implemented this statewide, and the results have been pretty phenomenal. North Carolina, when they were looking at going through the RESAP program, for anybody that knows Tommy Greer, who's in charge of their safety program at the statewide, Tommy was very adamant that the only way to really get complete buy-in at all systems were they were going to do unannounced visits and inspections. That was the only way to get everybody up to that level. If you think about that first chart I showed you was the 310, and we had that little tail out there that had the really big numbers. That was Tommy's goal in his state, to get those that were having the accidents consistently onto the program. I will tell you that Tommy told me that about 2/3 of the system were okay with this, 1/3 were not. But as a state group, they decided they were going to do this. They've had results. We handle their workers' compensation claims in North Carolina, and we were averaging about 280 to 300 claims each and every year, pretty steady. Over the last 4 years, that number's dropped to 140 or below each and every year. The results have been phenomenal in watching what they've done. And it's also paying off big dividends to them in their workers' comp retention program. A very key thing. Hard to implement. Tommy did tell me last time I was out in North Carolina that of the group that really did not want that, I think he's the one that still doesn't like it. But basically all the rest of them are very glad they did and couldn't imagine going back to doing it the way it was before. I was just in South Carolina on Wednesday. Get to travel all over the place. And they also implemented unannounced visits and inspections. One of the interesting things that the safety guy there, Todd Carter, told me was that in the old days, imagine this, before the RESAP team came in, they would go out there a month or so in advance and inspect the co-op and give them a list of things that you really need to fix and clean up here. He said on average, a co-op would get about 4 or 5 pages worth of notes, year in, year out, every time an inspection came up. They went to the unannounced visits, so even the RESAP, they don't know when they're coming out. Now, they're down after a visit to only having about a page of comments, because everybody knows we have to be functioning at this level each and every day because we don't know when they're coming in. It's the right thing to do, as opposed to, well, we don't like doing these little things, so we'll wait until it's inspection time, then we'll get them cleaned up. Think about how your co-op operates and see if that's key. Now, I will tell you that they just did their unannounced visits starting about 2 years ago. Lost time claims, they were generally having 25 to 20 claims a year. In fact, last year they had 19. We're almost done with the year, and they've only had 2 this year. And that's their goal, is to actually have none. So, that being said, what are some of the results we're seeing out of this? This is the national DART rate for all the co-ops, or at least all the ones that shared the data with us, and it's 750, 800 co-ops. And we've seen a pretty nice fall off in the average DART rates. We've kind of got that number down to about 2.5 right now. And I'll tell you, I'm not really happy with 2.5 either. It seems like we kind of hit a little plateau here at the moment. So the key is, can we get that number to going down farther? But it sure looks a lot better than the 3.83 we saw a few years back. So how's things look in Iowa? Looking at work comp claims themselves in Iowa, you can see the numbers are looking a lot better than they were. There's been a steady decline. We're right now in that 100, 115 range, which sure beats the 168 numbers we saw before then. Now, we'll tell you, I'll give you a little update on Federated, a couple things. You know, safety costs money. And back in 1959, when Federated first got started, one of the things they did was decide to return a portion of your premiums back to the statewide to help with safety. Now, earlier this year, I did this back in July, but just to give you an idea of what kind of funds were returned, this year's check was for $106,000. Plus, I'm going to show you a chart here in a second, what the claim counts have been doing. Our board of directors decided to make a bonus contribution that we did earlier in the year. And so that was for about $35,000, bringing our whole contribution for the year to $142,000. That's key. To give you an idea, this year we returned about $3.5 million back to the statewide across the country to help reduce losses and keep our insurance costs as low as we can. So one of the good things is our combined ratio. It's one of those things that we measure how we're doing as an insurance company. And basically it just compares the premiums that are paid to the overhead to run the company and the losses we're incurring. Now to give you an idea, that split is about 15% goes to overhead, which I'm pretty proud of that number. Industry-wise, 27%. So we're running pretty low there. But losses are the biggest part of your premium. That's 85 cents of every dollar goes to pay for losses. So 100% combines our target. If we have 110, that means we lost 10 cents. We didn't collect enough. If we're below 100, it means we collected a little too much. As of 9/30 of this year, I do have to apologize a little bit. Our combined was 92.1%. But I'm really glad about the number. And this chart here really tells that whole story. These are the claim counts we've experienced over the last 6-7 years. And you can see back in 07, 08, we were pretty much running about 13,000 claims a year in all the claims for all the co-ops we write business for. And we've actually got that number down to the 10,648, I think it is, last year at the end of 2012. Now this is kind of interesting because I have to set aside reserve dollars to pay for every claim that has happened as of a measurement date. So in other words, at the end of December 31, 2012, I had set aside funds to pay for every claim that we knew about and those that we did not know about. As a result, we have to have actuaries come in and look at our numbers. It's always an interesting time. Actuaries tend to look in the rearview mirrors and project out what your losses are going to be. And it's really hard to do. For instance, we just settled a claim yesterday here in Iowa from back in 2000. I can promise you at the end of 2000, I did not have specific dollars setting aside for that claim. Sometimes it's even longer. We have work comp claims on our books from the late 70s that are still open that we're making monthly payments to the employee. Sometimes they have surgeries later on, and we have to pay those. So those numbers are hard to project and hard to account for. But the actuary, at the end of 2011, I kind of said to him, you know, I think a lot of these emphasis on safety, the reset program, the strategy labs, and all this, I think we're starting to see some tangible results out of this. And he was kind of like, yeah, maybe. And maybe you're lucky. Who knows? So last year, at the end of 2012, he comes into my office and says, hey, Phil, I think I'm seeing a change in trends. It's like, really? I kind of noticed that myself. So as a result, he was lowering some of his prior estimates. In fact, if you look at our number this year, it's really a result of lowering the estimated claims for the past couple years. It's kind of a cumulative effect. I will tell you, it can go the other way too if claims start getting worse in a hurry. So we have to watch out and be diligent in that. So now, I know Dwayne Reckenberg's out there somewhere. Where are you at? Ah, there you are. And Brian Cranberry, who's my vice chairman of my board, and Dwayne will tell you, what I'm about to tell you next is really a result of his leadership, I'm sure, being chairman and everything when he was. But since the numbers are coming in so good and everything, at our last board meeting in November, Brian just told me, you know, we got to do something. We got to put money back in the hands of our membership. So they approved us retiring another $6.2 million of prior margins that we'd allocated to you guys. So in December, those checks will go out. And if you look at the numbers for Iowa, the December payment will total about $154,000. So watch your mailbox for checks. It'd be a good thing to have. When you look at your allocation from last year, the $19.4 million of margins we had in Iowa, you guys got about $450,000 of that. And this payment, added along with the ones that we paid back in March earlier, kick our payments up to about $491,000 back to our members here in Iowa. And that's important. My goal is to break even on the insurance side of things, and we're doing a little bit better than that. So as a result, we're kicking up our payments, and this year will be a total of $14 million that we will have paid out. So it's good numbers, it's good to see. I think safety's paying off. We're seeing fewer claims, less dollars, and we keep going from there. So with that, I would like to say thank you and be safe, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any. DART rate, the DART rate is basically the day, it's for work comp claims that are out there. If they had to miss work, if you had to give them light duty or transfers, things like that, and it's compared to, I believe you divide by 200,000 or something, it's mathematically all done, but it's a standard rate that everybody has to do on their OSHA forms annually, so. Yep. So with that, thanks a lot for all your support.